How famous people really lived in the 1950s. There was a time when fame looked very different from what it looks like today. In the 1950s, being famous did not automatically mean living in constant public exposure. There were no social media feeds, no smartphone cameras following every move, and no instant access to the private thoughts of celebrities, politicians, entertainers, or wealthy public figures. What people knew about famous figures usually came through controlled channels such as magazines, television appearances, radio interviews, and newspaper coverage. That distance made the mystery even stronger. But behind the polished photographs and glamorous appearances, how did famous people actually live in the 1950s? The answer is more complex, and in many ways more human, than modern audiences may expect. For many well-known actors, singers, broadcasters, and public personalities of the decade, daily life was built around discipline, routine, and presentation. Fame in the 1950s often came with an expectation of order. Appearance mattered. Manners mattered. The ability to remain calm in public mattered. Many public figures understood that reputation was not built overnight. It was built slowly through consistency, restraint, and visible self-control. Hollywood stars of the era, for example, often lived under strict studio systems or publicity structures. Their wardrobes, schedules, interviews, and even public behavior could be influenced by the expectations of studios, agents, and managers. This does not mean they lived artificial lives every moment of the day, but it does mean that many of them learned to divide life into two worlds, the public image and the private routine. And private routine, surprisingly, was often far less chaotic than people imagine. Many famous figures from the 1950s lived in households that reflected the values of the time: order, hospitality, formal meal times, and a clear concern for social presentation. Homes were often elegant, but not always extreme in the modern sense of luxury. Good furniture, carefully chosen decor, framed photographs, bookshelves, dining rooms used with intention, and formal sitting areas were common among those who wanted their homes to reflect respectability and taste. There was also a strong culture of entertaining at home. Invitations mattered. Dinner gatherings mattered. The way a person hosted guests could shape both public perception and private relationships. For many famous people, home was not only a place of rest, it was also a setting in which identity was reinforced. The 1950s also moved at a different rhythm. Famous people worked hard, but many of them lived with more separation between public life and private life than modern celebrities do. Even when they were constantly busy, there were still natural limits created by technology, communication, and social expectations. A telephone might ring, a publicist might call, or a newspaper might publish a story, but there was no endless digital demand every minute of the day. This gave many well-known figures a kind of distance that no longer exists in quite the same way. That distance helped preserve mystery. It also helped protect routine. For singers and recording artists, life in the 1950s often involved a combination of travel, rehearsal, radio, live performance, and image management. Style was essential. Voice was essential. Poise was essential. But success also depended on reliability. Showing up prepared mattered. Performing consistently mattered. Speaking clearly in interviews mattered. Many stars were admired not only because they were talented, but because they appeared composed. Composure was one of the defining features of the era. Actors, too, often lived under intense pressure to maintain standards. This included grooming, fitness, etiquette, and public behavior. The public expected stars to look refined. Men were often expected to appear polished and controlled. Women were often expected to embody elegance, beauty, and grace. These expectations could be limiting and sometimes unfair, but they also created a culture in which public figures were judged by far more than raw talent. They were judged by the way they carried themselves. Politicians and public officials in the 1950s also lived within a culture of strong visual symbolism. Clothing, speech, posture, and family presentation all mattered deeply. Public life was not only about policy, it was also about confidence, decorum, and trust. The image of the home, the marriage, the schedule, and the public appearance all helped shape influence. For wealthy individuals and prominent business figures, life in the 1950s often reflected restraint as much as status. Wealth was visible, but in many circles there was still an old-fashioned respect for understatement. A fine car, a tailored suit, a well-kept office, and a stable family image could say more than flashy display. Reputation was part of wealth. The appearance. That is one of the most fascinating differences between then and now. Today, fame often rewards constant visibility. In the 1950s, fame often rewarded controlled visibility. This created a very different emotional atmosphere around public figures. They seemed more distant, but also more durable. More formal, but also more memorable. The public did not feel entitled to know everything. And because of that, what was known seemed to carry more weight. There were, of course, many struggles behind the scenes. Fame has never removed pressure, loneliness, ambition, or personal complexity. But one of the striking things about the 1950s is that many famous people were still expected to maintain dignity in the face of those pressures. Public disorder was not admired. Self-destruction was not usually marketed as authenticity. Losing control was seen as damaging, not entertaining. That expectation shaped behavior. It also shaped how homes were run, how schedules were built, and how people protected their names. If we step back and ask what made the lives of famous people in the 1950s feel so distinct, the answer may be this: structure. There was more structure in public image, more structure in domestic life, more structure in routine, and more structure in how success was presented to the world. Not every life was happy. Not every marriage was strong. Not every image matched reality. But the culture itself rewarded discipline, privacy, and visible order. And perhaps that is why the era still fascinates people today. When modern audiences look back at the 1950s, they are not only seeing fashion, cars, films, and old television clips. They are also seeing a lost way of managing public identity, a way of living in which mystery, restraint, and presentation were part of daily life. In many ways, famous people in the 1950s lived under pressure, but they also lived with boundaries. And those boundaries made their lives feel, at least from the outside, more composed. That does not mean better in every sense, but it does mean different. And in a world now shaped by exposure, speed, and endless reaction, that difference feels more interesting than ever. Life behind the spotlight in the 1950s was not simply glamorous. It was organized. It was image-conscious. It was disciplined. It was often formal. And above all, it was shaped by a world in which privacy still had real value. That may be one of the biggest reasons we still look back on that era with fascination. Because beyond the fame, beyond the headlines, and beyond the polished publicity images, there were routines, rules, standards, and habits that belonged to another age. And once you begin to notice those details, the past starts to feel alive again.
If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.